So how does one introduce a talent like Barry Zevan? Somebody that's had such an eclectic background and has met so many wonderful people in his life. Barry started his career on radio as a singer in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he hails from, singing to the Starlets on Parade radio show. He was 5 years old then. He got his first acting job at age 11. These are all things I gleaned from your book, so. Yeah. Since then, Barry's gone on to meet some of the most wonderful people in Hollywood. He is personal friends with Louis Anderson, still to this day, Mel Brooks, Shirley Jones, and Jerry Stiller, who encouraged Barry to write his book, My Life Among the Giants. And he's got a copy here today. I've got a copy too, if anybody wants to look at that. I met Barry about 10 years ago, I think, at an event, and we became very fast friends. We started working together, and we've done some projects together. And Barry is still working to this day, even though we all know him as Barry Zevan, the wild and wacky weatherman we all loved in the 70s and 80s. He's still working today as a weatherman even, and doing other jobs. You might see him on, I think it's KSTP, doing an Ebenezer spots right now. But he's also doing a YouTube channel where he still is doing the weather every Wednesday, and it's called Retro Weather. It's my honor to introduce my friend, Barry Zevan.
Thank you, Stephanie. My honor to be here. Thanks to Stephanie and our longtime friendship. Retro Weather, by the way, is introduced by Louis Anderson every week, and it's a lot of fun. In order to make any money from it, you have to have 30,000 subscribers. We have 467 subscribers. So anyway, but it's just fun to do, and if it becomes monetarily successful, then fine. If not, fine. I'm 82 years old. There aren't that many years left to enjoy the money. But regardless, in my book is in the very front is a picture of yours truly with President Truman. I interviewed him for a half hour in 1963. I had been, in addition to doing the weather, I was also a speech doctor occasionally for Senator Frank Church of Idaho. That was in Idaho Falls. And so Frank said, you know, Truman is coming to stump for me to get reelected. Do you want to interview him? Well, the story about that is in the book. It's available on Amazon, by the way, but I'm not here to sell books. Anyway, the title of the speech today is Confessions of a TV Weatherman. And I think it illustrates how we never know how things are going to turn out or why they turn out the way they do. I started, as Stephanie mentioned, as a voice singer on KDKA radio, the world's first radio station, by the way, first commercial station. And in later years became friends, and we still are, with Peter Marshall, who used to host Hollywood Squares. Peter was on that show 10 years before I was. So it was one of the very first radio shows. And then in actually, I'll start way, way back. When I was 2 years old, my grandfather, I was kind of born into show business, and I never thought weather would be any part of my life. But my grandfather was first violinist for the Pittsburgh Symphony, but he also conducted orchestras. And in 1939, Arthur Treacher came through Pittsburgh. How many remember Arthur Treacher? Good, a few. Anyway, he was doing a bond drive for Great Britain because Britain had just entered the war in 1939. And so anyway, Arthur Treacher lifted me up on stage and said, "This child was born for the footlights." So my mother kind of took it seriously. And in 1948, after the singing continued on KDKA, she heard that the Pittsburgh Playhouse was having auditions for anybody to come and go to the drama school. And so she enrolled me in the drama school, and one of my fellow schoolmates was Shirley Jones. Shirley had become Miss Pittsburgh 3 years later, and in '51, and I did her first play with her. We've kept in touch all those years, and she, her husband, Marty Ingalls, who sadly died 2 years ago, was also a high school friend of mine in New York City when we moved to New York to continue my acting career. Anyway, and I did Shirley's first play with her before she went to New York and got cast by Rodgers and Hammerstein in the Broadway version of Oklahoma. The thing about this particular business is it's a friend's business. It's like anything else in life, really. It has to do with relationships. Who cares about you? Who doesn't care about you? And I've had a few of those too. But it's really been fascinating to me how this all turned out. Well, in the acting, and eventually I'll get to how I got to be a weatherman here. Eventually we moved to New York because a talent scout was in the audience in a summer stock play I was doing in Western Pennsylvania. And he told my mother, he said he'd be perfect for a new show that's opening on Broadway. It's called The Happy Time. And so my mom, in making a long story very short, we moved to New York, and I got an understudy role in that play, but, and among the people in it were Ava Gabor and Kirk Kasnar and some of the others. But anyway, one of the stagehands during rehearsal had me up in Central Park on a seesaw, and he bounced the seesaw, and I broke my foot. So that ended that Broadway play. Regardless, I went to Forest Hills High School, and the first high school I went to New York, and in the school were also Art Garfunkel and a lady named Ina Balin, who later became an actress, but sadly died at a young age. But regardless, it was quite a time, and my mother had heard of a school called Lodge Professional Children's School. It was for kids who were acting at the time and not learning how to act, but actually acting. So we knew that some parts were coming up for me in some television shows. They were all live in those days. So we moved into Manhattan, and my schoolmates were Elliot Gould, Sal Mineo, Leslie Uggams, Tuesday Weld, Sandra Dee, Patty Duke, Carol Lindley. We were all together. And Sal was my best friend in high school. Well, there's something that I've forgotten here. Forgive my age here. Something that happened before that. But regardless, I'll probably think of it in the next half hour. Anyway, I was in the school, and Sal was one of my best friends. Also a guy named David Winters, who later was in West Side Story. I was almost in West Side Story too. But regardless, it was an experience that meant your friends were going to help you. So, to get to where the weather was, first, before that, I got cast, thanks to David Winters, as a student on Mr. Peepers with Tony Randall and Wally Cox. And we did the show in a theater that no longer exists. It's called the RKO Center Theater, Rockefeller Center. And the night before we did our show, everything was live then, nothing on tape. Was Your Show of Shows with Sid Caesar, Carl Reiner, Imogene Coca, just the whole bunch. And we showed up for rehearsals for Mr. Peepers on Sunday morning at 7, and they were striking the sets from the night before. It also included writers named Mel Brooks and Woody Allen. I, in later years, directed Woody Allen in 3 television shows, and it's in the book here, including the photos. But when you're part of history, you don't really know you are. And we had no idea how this was all going to evolve. But anyway, I got the part on Peepers, and then continued to get some parts occasionally on the Alcoa Hour and Studio One, live drama shows. And I got a call from an agent in New York who was representing Universal Pictures, and she said, "You have been chosen to play Tony Curtis as a young boy in a film called 6 Bridges to Cross." It was about the Brinks robbery in Boston in the 1950s. How many remember that? Nobody. Yes, one person. Good. Regardless, the agent had me come down, and she said, "You know any other kids who look like you look like juvenile delinquents?" It's true. I had more grease on my hair than I have now, and a lot of ringlets and a lot of hair. So anyway, I thought of Sal and his brother Mike. They were the headshots I saw in this headshot book. And she said, "Oh, they'd be perfect as extras." Well, 3 days later, I got a call to go up to Universal to supposedly do a cursory reading for the part, because I had supposedly already been chosen by the director. So I get off the elevator. Universal had a building on Park Avenue. Every time I see that building, I shake my fist. But anyway, I got off the elevator, and who's sitting on a bench but Sal and Mineo. And so I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I went in to read for the director, Joe Pevney. He later directed all the Star Trek series. I should have kept in touch with him. But anyway, I read, and he said, "Excellente." All this is burned into my brain, believe me. And he said, "You're in good shape. We'll be in touch in a couple of days." So I went back out to the elevator bank, and I said goodbye to Sal. 3 days later, I got a call from the agent. She said, "Your kindness to recommend your friend didn't pay off for you. He got the part, and you got no part because you both look alike." So it really hit me hard. And show business can be a very cruel business, by the way. Before I get to more of this, and I'll remember to get back to it, before that, during my pre-Air Force days, and I'm getting to the Air Force in a second, I got a call from Dick Van Patten's mother. She was an agent, and I later did a 1 year-long tour with Dick in 2001 and 2002 in the Sunshine Boys, along with Frank Gorshin, who I also grew up with in Pittsburgh. But anyway, the agent, Joe Van Patten, she said, "Barry, there's a new play called West Side Story. I want you to go read for Jerome Robbins, or at least meet him." He was the director, choreographer, of course. And so she didn't tell me what the play was about. So I go up, and it was only 3 doors down from where I was on West 46th Street. And Robbins is sitting behind a desk with 3 other people. And he said, "Tell me about yourself, kid." I said, "Well," and I told him about myself briefly. He said, "You would be perfect for this play, except you sound just like Jimmy Stewart." And if I'd known they wanted a tough guy, I would have put on a tough guy accent, you know? Yeah, would have been that play in the movie. So, anyway, I could have killed her. I told Dick in later years when we were on that tour, I said, if your mother had told me they wanted tough kids from the west side of Manhattan, I would have been a tough kid. So, and it turns out that 3 or 4 kids in my school were in the original Broadway production as well as the film, David Winters included. So, back to getting this bad news for the film, I got very discouraged, and my mother said, Sal, it's going to be getting all your parts. You should find something else to do to fall back on, because this may not work out for acting anymore. So she said, why not even think of joining the service? Oh, well. Well, the next morning, I played hooky from school, and I heard an Air Force recruiting announcement. And it said you could join for 6 months active and 7.5 years reserve and still get all your GI Bill and VA benefits. This was right at the end of the Korean War. So I thought, wow, and I'm very direction oriented. So my mother tells me to do something, I will do it. So by golly, without telling her, I went down to the Air Force recruiting office, which was right across the street from where she worked. She was an IRS auditor in Lower Manhattan in the U.S. Custom House, where the IRS had their offices, and that included Wall Street. So the Air Force recruiting office was right across the street. I knew it because I had come down to visit my mom a few times. And at that time, you could join when you were 17. I was 17 at the time. And I joined. So I called my mother on the payphone. We didn't have cell phones then, of course. And I said, well, I did it. You did what? I joined the Air Force. You what? You what? She went crazy. 3 days later, I was on my way to Sampson Air Force Base in upstate New York. We were on the shores of Lake Seneca, the Finger Lakes. Colder there in October than it is here now. Oh, it was terrible. Anyway, basic training for me was like a bad Donald O'Connor movie. It was the worst. It wasn't like the posters said it was going to be. But anyway, I got through basic, and at the end of basic training, as you know, if you were in the service, you find out what your job's going to be in the service. They alert you, and I had not been alerted yet, and everybody else was, and then I had a friend in placement, and he said, well, Barry, we have 2 things open, motor pool and meteorology. And of course I took motor pool. Oh, no. I guess I didn't. No, I took meteorology because I had also, in my life, wanted to be an astronomer. And so anything to do with the heavens or whatever, they were kind of married to each other. Meteorology, by the way, is the study of motion around spheres. If you have a ball that's moving, it's actually a meteorological occurrence. Anyway, so I went to Chanute Air Force Base in Rantoul, Illinois, which was where all the weather jobs were taught, and I became what they call a meteorological technician. Easy for me to say. Anyway, so a med tech. So we were the ones who provided all the information to the forecasters, and once we would get out of school. So I got stationed in Anchorage, Alaska, TDY, temporary duty, and also in Denver, where I got out of the service. And I actually got my GED, high school diploma, in Denver too, because I had quit high school in New York. And there's another thing I learned too. Peter Jennings and I were like brothers. I miss Peter very much. Peter never graduated from high school, but his father was president of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So it really didn't matter for his career. Anyway, so Peter and I used to joke about that. I said, well, I didn't graduate either except in the service. So anyway, when I got out of the service, I needed a job. And my grandfather, I moved back to New York, temporarily in Washington, D.C., briefly, as a clerk at the Mayflower Hotel, which was right across the street from what is now ABC. Not in those days, but anyway, so I needed a job, and I wanted to get back into acting, because I didn't think weather would ever help me. And my grandfather had a business partner in Pittsburgh named Bob Finkel, and Bob's son, or Bill Finkel, Bill's son, Bob, had directed the Colgate Comedy Hour with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. He was very successful in producing and directing, and he was now producing the Perry Como Show. And so my grandfather said, will Bob meet with Barry to maybe get him on the show, on the Como Show, on a regular basis because of the Ray Charles singers. And so, by golly, Bob met me in his office. He said, sing something for me, kid. And I sang Turalura Laurel, an Irish lullaby. It's the only thing I could think of at the time. And he said, okay, you're in. I said, what am I in? He said, you're going to be one of the Ray Charles singers, Perry's backup group, every Saturday night for as long as you want to be, or as long as it can last. I thanked him. It was then I joined the union. Actually, I had joined the union before because of Mr. Peepers. And so I joined all 3 broadcast unions, 2 broadcast unions, 1 acting union, in 1953. One of my union cards is still in my pocket, and I'm second vice president of SAG-AFTRA here in the Twin Cities. Been on the board here for a lot of years. SAG-AFTRA is the Screen Actors Guild and American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. So anyway, every Saturday night at 7 o'clock, we were singing on the Como Show. And for rehearsals, we would get all our notes on a Thursday to prepare for Saturday. I worked with every star who ever existed, and one of them who became a really good friend for years was Rosemary Clooney, George Clooney's aunt. And George hadn't even been born at that time. But anyway, in fact, Rosemary, God bless her, she had me MC a special show for her in Edmonton, Alberta, several years later. And she was just so sweet. There's some stories about Rosemary in the book. And how kind she was to her sister and to other performers who were a little nervous to be on this show. Well, how I got to do the weather. Frank Gallup was the name of Perry's announcer, and he had a very distinctive voice, and he had been a stockbroker in Boston, and some guy from NBC was in this stockbroker's office and heard Frank talk, and he said, you belong on NBC as an announcer. And so Frank did get an announcing job, and then was chosen to be the announcer for the Perry Como Show. Oh, Mr. Como, I don't know if you remember, that's the way he sounded. But anyway, Frank and I were sitting in a rehearsal break. We did the theater, the Como Show in the Ziegfeld Theater. It was the original theater where the original Ziegfeld Follies were performed. And NBC converted it into a television theater. Billy Rose had an apartment upstairs. As you may remember, he was married to Fanny Bryce, and who later became Funny Girl to most audiences when Barbra Streisand did the part. So anyway, Frank said, gee, you look kind of depressed, Barry. I said, well, that's the way I always looked. He said, no. He said, really? He said, what's the matter? I said, well, Sal's going to get all these parts, and Sal had already then done Rebel Without a Cause and Giant and some of these other films. And so anyway, Frank said, why don't you get into the announcing business? He said, you have a good voice for announcing. Go out west somewhere for 2 years and come back here, and then you'll be announcing here. So, being direction oriented, my mother, God bless her, wrote letters to 75 stations out west. That's because Frank, the next week, got us a book with a list of all the stations in the country. He stole it from some NBC vice president's desk, he told me that. So, anyway, and I did my audition at WOR in New York, was a great radio station, still is, because one of our distant cousins was a guy named Phil Tonkin, and he had been a personality on WOR, so he got me the audition. It's the worst audition tape that's ever been made. I still have it. It's a reel-to-reel tape, and I still have a reel-to-reel recorder at home, or a playback unit. So if I want to get really depressed, I listen to that. Anyway, the first station that said yes was in Helena, Montana, for $55 a week. And to be news director, disc jockey, announcer. Well, I got to Helena, and the whole story's in the book. All is in the book. I'm not selling books, though. Anyway, so got to Helena, and I didn't realize all the technical stuff you had to do, because you had to slip start your records, you had to queue up tapes that were all reel to reel. Nowadays, all they do is push a button and everything starts. So you had to be an octopus as well as an announcer. Well, the boss told me, he said, this is after 1 month. He said, you know, Barry, he said, you have tons of talent. He said, but this technical stuff is driving you nuts. He said, what if I recommend you to a television station owner in Missoula to work on television and be a switcher, director, announcer. Switcher means just pushing the buttons to get the network on or show. So anyway, this was the days before videotape too, and you had to load film. Well, anyway, making a long story short, I got the job in Missoula, and after the first month, the boss asked me, he said, do you know anything about the weather? Bingo! Yes, I do. And I showed him my Air Force certificate. So he said, well, I'll tell you what, we were a CBS affiliate at that time. My granddaughter is now their anchor, and she's been an anchor there for 5 years, and she just was named 2 months ago Montana's Broadcaster of the Year. So God bless her. Anyway, I watch her once in a while, thanks to the internet. So anyway, he said, do it any way you want to do it. He said, we have a board we've made up for you. It has an outline of the United States, and I had to do it in chalk. So for the first broadcast, I had this very heavy lavalier mic on, had to walk into my own set, the whole works. And I'm starting to do the weather, but my back is to the audience. So I'll do a little acting here for you now. So I'm going like this and this, and I thought, it's very rude, you're supposed to look at your audience. So I started looking around like that, back at the camera. That's how that happened. Just to keep eye contact with the audience. So I heard the newscaster, who was a wonderful guy, Ron Richards was his name, but anyway, he was laughing across the studio, and I thought, oh brother, this is my first and last weathercast. So the boss called right after the show, and he said, Barry, you keep looking back at that camera. We'll call you the Peekaboo Weatherman, and that can be your trademark for years if you want it to be. That's how that happened. So, eventually, first of all, I got married to my first wife, the first of 29 wives. No. Only 28. No. There have been 3. But the business does it to you. Anyway, Dorothy was a rancher's daughter from St. Ignatius, Montana. And Dorothy and I got married. And I knew, of course, I wanted to provide for her and if we ever had children. So I moved to 2 or 3 stations in Montana for a little bit bigger bucks. Then I heard about a job in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada with the CBC. And I got a job there before Dorothy and I were married. And my boss had been Lauren Green's understudy as chief announcer for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation in Toronto. His name was Sam Pitt. I kind of get goosebumps right now. It sounds dramatic and emotional, but he had the most incredible voice you have ever heard. And dramatic and really, really knew his stuff. So I learned more from Sam about quality than I could ever describe. Anyway, Dorothy and I got married. We lived our first few months in Lethbridge. Dorothy got pregnant 3 months after we were married, and I heard about dual citizenship, that if a child is born to American parents in another country, they have citizenship in that country too. So I thought, and this will show you I have no genius, I thought if we ever get into a war with Canada, I don't want our child to have to choose. So we decided to move back to the States. Didn't know where we were headed. All we owned was in my 1948 Dodge, packed to the gills. Wound up in Idaho Falls, Idaho, the first night. And it was early enough at night, actually it was around 5 in the afternoon, where I knew they had a television station there. And I called and I got hold of the general manager, and I told him my story, that I'm looking for work. He said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, why don't you do a promo live for us tonight on the air? And I did, and they hired me. And I thought I'd be there for 6 months. I was there for 5 years. Well, among the things that happened that eventually enriched my life as far as experiences, one of the first things, of course, was the Truman thing. The other was I got a call from a friend who had worked for Art Linkletter. How many remember Art Linkletter? Great. Well, he and I became friends until he died. And how that happened was John Goodell's other boss called me, and who I knew. John Goodell was Art Linkletter's producer. He said, we want you to film Art learning how to ski with his family in Sun Valley. And Sun Valley was only 2 hours away. So anyway, what happened was we got permission from the station because they were going to run it on House Party, and we would get credit. So I was there for 2 weeks with Link and his family. And there are quite a few stories about what happened there too. His daughter Diane was very insecure. She later committed suicide. The first thing she ever said to me, getting in the car, was, my father hates me. And I thought, oh, and hello to you, Diane. It was sad. It was very sad. And I was later with Art in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, at a thing that I had to do for a week with the cast of Spencer's Mountain, which was filmed at Jackson Hole. Art was there, and he said I should have definitely paid more attention to Diane and her problem. So There is one Linkletter story, though, I want to insert here. In later years, and I'll tell you the Truman story, but in later years, Art and I became really good friends. It's ironic, though, he's so squeaky clean, he was, and his office was in the Larry Flint building in Beverly Hills, who published Hustler magazine, so Art must have gotten pretty cheap rent. Anyway, he said, have I ever told you about Walt Disney being broke and my connection? I said, no. This is a fun story. He said, Disney called me up in 1955 in the spring and said, we're opening Disneyland, Art, and I want you to MC the opening, but I can't afford to pay you. And he said, I can obviously pay you after we open, so you figure a way to be paid. So Art said he waited a couple of hours. Linkletter, by the way, was an adopted child in Medicine Hat, Alberta. And I don't know what his real last name was, but the family named Linkletter did adopt him. He became a hobo because he wanted to get to the United States but didn't have any money. And so he rode the rails for a year and finally wound up in LA. And John Goodell, who later became his producer, heard Art talking outside a theater in LA that Goodell owned, and he said, have you ever been in radio? And Art said, no, I'm not even close. He said, what are you going to be? And that's how timing is everything. So anyway, so Linkletter told me, he said he called Disney back. And he said, I know you're going to sell a lot of film at that place. Why don't you just give me 10% of the retail sales price of every roll of film you sell there in perpetuity, and we'll call it a deal. Disney said yes. And Art said he made more money from those rolls of film than television, radio, or anything. With the money, he bought 40,000 acres of tomatoes in Oceanside, California, because he knew the president of Hunt's Ketchup, and got the president of Hunt's Ketchup to say, yes, we'll use your tomatoes. So Lois, who sadly died a few years ago, Art's widow, she kept collecting the money from those tomatoes because of that film. So that was fun. President Truman, there were three of us who were chosen to interview him. Frank decided that it would not be fair for me to just interview him alone. So we had a guy from a newspaper, one from radio, and me from television. So if I may, see how we're doing on time here. I'll conclude with what Truman told me. First thing he said was, I never wanted to be president or vice president. He said, I was sitting on the edge of my bed at the Mule Block Hotel in Kansas City, looking at the phone, because I had heard that President Roosevelt wanted to choose me to be his running mate in 1944. So I kept looking at the phone saying, please don't ring, please don't ring. And of course, the phone rang. And I kept saying, yes, Mr. President, yes, Mr. President, because you just didn't say no to the President of the United States, especially that president. Said, so I got on the train to Chicago, where the convention was that year. And the next night I was introduced to the nation. Well, I became his vice president after he got reelected for the fourth time. Now we go to April 12th, 1945. I'm sitting in my office at the Senate office building, and Sam Rayburn, then Speaker of the House, came rushing into my office and saying, Harry, we have to get over to the White House right away, get Bess and Margaret over there with you. This is important. What is it? I'll tell you in the car. So he got hold of Bess, and he said she gave him some guff. That's how he put it. about leaving this party where they were. And he said, I'll send the Secret Service over to get you if you don't come over. So, anyway, he said he got in the car with Rayburn, and Rayburn said, Harry, the president's dead. And he said, I would much rather, been hit square across the face full force with a baseball bat than to have heard that news. So we got to the front steps of the White House. Mrs. Roosevelt was standing outside. And I got out of the car and I said, oh, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry, what can I do for you? She said, oh, Harry, it's not what you can do for me. You're the boy who's in trouble now. And he said, if you recall my somber look when I was taking the oath of office, it was because of those words. And I never forgot them until VJ Day, till we ended the war in Japan. So the next morning, he said we had to have a cabinet meeting. And at the end of the cabinet meeting, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, said, Mr. President, there's something about which you don't know, but you definitely need to know. He said, what is it? He said, well, for 2 years, we've been working on something called the Manhattan Project. And it's the development of a new weapon we're calling the atomic bomb. He said, why wasn't I told about this? He said, because President Roosevelt didn't think he could handle the information. In later years, it was learned that Roosevelt chose Truman to be his running mate because he thought he was the dumbest one in Congress. So Truman was pretty insulted and also felt very badly that Roosevelt would feel that way. Anyway, we evolved into May of that year. They did the first test at Alamogordo, New Mexico. How many have been to that site? At least one, that's good. It's like the moon out there, and that desert is still radioactive, white sands. And it was successful, so they ended the war in Europe on Truman's birthday that year, May 8th, was VE Day. So they had to focus all their attention to the Pacific, and they decided to drop the bomb on Hiroshima on my birthday, August 5th, 1945. It was August 6th in Japan. Well, anyway, they dropped the bomb. And I said, did you have any compunction about killing 100,000 civilians? He said, no. He said, if we had land invaded Japan as MacArthur wanted to do, we would have lost 500,000 American soldiers in a land invasion. So we were surprised that the Japanese didn't surrender right away. So we waited 3 days and then dropped it on Nagasaki. And then it still took them 2 days to say, okay. So as you know, it was the end of the war was officially signed September 1st on the deck of the battleship Missouri. How many have been to that spot? And as you know, it's all encased in plexiglass now, protecting the desk and everything. But it's very, very powerful. I could tell a lot more, and there is a lot more, but how about some questions and answers? Do you have any answers? Any questions? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Would you have a song you would like to sing?
Do I have a song I'd like to sing? Not with my voice now. What? Anybody else?
Question.
Yes, sir.
Here. We need to use the mics for this.
I am Mike, I don't.
Dusty, who was your first boss at KSTP?
My first boss was Stanley Hubbard, SS Hubbard, and I just got a Christmas card from him today. Yeah. Bob Newhart was responsible for me getting here. I was on television eventually in Las Vegas for 4 years, and I had a talk show as well as doing the weather. And all these stars from the Strip, thanks to Robert Goulet, he started this parade of stars coming on my show, my weather show. And So, and I also had a talk show in the mornings, and Newhart said, Barry, you belong in a much bigger market. Yeah, well, I guess, do we have time to tell one more story? It's how I got here. Newhart said, why don't you see if there's an ad in Broadcasting Magazine for a weatherman like you? Well, by golly, the next week in broadcasting, there was an ad. It said, Upper Midwest major market television station wants personality weatherman, send videotape and resume to such and such. They never tell you the town. So 10 days later, I got a call from Ralph Dolan at KSTP, Stanley Hubbard's right-hand man, who saved Stanley's life, by the way, in an airplane crash. But anyway, he said, we want to talk to you about coming here. So I told Newhart it was the Twin Cities, and he said, oh, he said, that's fantastic. He said, great market, and you could be there forever or use it as a stepping stone if you wanted to. So I came back, long story very short, I accepted the job, but there was no contract. They didn't sign contracts at that time. And the pay was only $5,000 a year more than I was making in Las Vegas, which at that time was the 120th market in the country. So, but I saw the quality of the building and of the people, and they promised me, they said, you'll be given a raise very fast as soon as things start. So I got back to Vegas. They wanted me to stay till November. This was in August. And I got a call, and KSTP said, that's fine. So I got a call from an agent in Beverly Hills. His name was Steve Silverberg. He said, Barry, Nancy Sinatra and Dionne Warwick's husband say you belong on television in Las Vegas, in Los Angeles. And so I said, well, that's very kind. I said, except I just accepted a job in Minneapolis, St. Paul. He said, well, they don't sign contracts there. I thought, well, what the heck? So I just thought, just for the fun of it, I'll give him the tapes. He drove up from LA. We met in the lobby of Caesar's Palace with a shopping bag full of videotapes that I gave him. These were these big round videotapes. And I never heard anything back until one morning in November, when I also did the news in the morning. I got a call in the newsroom and he said, you're hired. And I said, who are you and what am I hired for? And he said, well, my name is Bill Fife, and I'm news director at KTLA Channel 5 in Los Angeles, and we want you to be our new weatherman. You'll be working with a new anchor named Tom Snyder, and we'll start you at $40,000 a year. I was going to start at $17,000 KSTP. And I said, Mr. Fife, the moving van is literally in our driveway right now, loading up for us to move back to the Twin Cities. He said, well, they don't sign contracts there. The universal knowledge. He said, if you feel you have a moral obligation, we'll catch up sometime. Well, there's so much to tell, but anyway, the bottom line is that I did come back here and it was successful. And then I got a call from Washington, D.C. to go down there for almost triple the money. Mr. Hubbard almost matched it, but I thought, well, I've told him I'm coming, so that's that. Worst mistake of my life, because Mr. Hubbard offered me a lifetime job. He said, you can stay here the rest of your life, and I'll put that in writing. And I said, Mr. Hubbard, I never had a lot of money. I want to find out what it's like. Well, I found out. So anyway, Willard Scott and I became very close friends. We had dinner every Monday night. And Al Roker actually came to town on the Independence station. We invited him to one of our dinners. He only came once. We were too boring, I guess. But anyway, I had to go to New York for something, and Bill Fife, the fellow from LA, had later become vice president of ABC News. I met with him in his office, and he said, Barry, if you had gone with me at KTLA, I would have chosen you to be Good Morning America's first weatherman. 2 million a year. So that's part of my life. Anybody else have any questions?
Hi, Barry.
Hi.
One of my favorite shows that you ever did, I believe it was in the early 70s, 3-year ski scene.
Oh yeah, the ski scene. Yeah, I did that too. Yeah.
And there was I think it was all 3 years, there was a gentleman that was on that show that, I'm pretty sure it was all 3 years. He was your assistant for the program.
Yeah.
And he would come on and do the exercise, the routines and that. That was my brother.
With Chuck Coonshire?
Glenn Peterson.
Who?
Glenn Peterson.
Peterson. I'm
So
sorry.
he would come on, and you guys would talk about the ski areas, the ski scene, the updates, Whiter Savage, Billy Kidd that were coming
Yeah.
in for
Sure.
all the races down in Athens, et cetera. And that was the beginning of my career for skiing, in both teaching and being part of the national ski program.
Mhm.
So you were my inspiration.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's great. Yeah, skiing became half my life. I've produced several documentaries, and quite a few of them on skiing. Been lucky enough to ski everywhere in the world except for Australia. And
I'll tell you what it's like, Barry, I've been there.
yeah, Mount Kosciuszko.
Yep.
Ah, congratulations. There's, as I say, there's so much more to tell. Yeah, I did a film for the Shah of Iran, a ski film. They wanted to attract more skiers to Iran, and so a friend of mine became a dear friend. His name was Ardashir Zahedi, who was the Shah's son-in-law in Washington, D.C., and he said, Barry, he said, you know, we have skiing in Iran. And I had just heard about that a month before, because I was also a ski writer for Ski Magazine. And so they got me over there, and Barbara Walters had just finished insulting the Shah, so he decided to not do any filming with us, but they treated us like royalty. And then I came back the second time with Billy Kidd and Susie Chaffee, and that film is, you can see it on the internet. It's called the Iranian ski scene, but anyway, sorry. Just keep going and going and going. I'll be the Energizer Bunny.
Hey, Barry, we're going to wrap it up. I
Okay.
just want to come over and say thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And fist bump.
Yeah.
Can we give Barry a hand, please?
Thank you very much.
He will talk all day if we let him, so. But we're working people, we got to get back to work.
Right.
Thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thank you.